Sir, hands up, hands up. I'm Senator Alex Padilla. I have questions for the secretary, because the fact of the matter is a half a dozen violent criminals that you're rotating on your
back. Hands behind your back.
If you let my hands go and put them behind my back.
All right, cool. One hand, lay flat, lay flat.
California Senator Alex Padilla shown there being forcibly removed from the room where Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem was giving a press conference. This all went down at a federal building in Los Angeles where the Secretary was addressing the violent protests that have been happening in that city for a week, and President Trump's deployment of the National Guard and Marines to the area.
After Padilla was removed from the room, the Department of Homeland Security put out this statement on X. Senator Padilla chose disrespectful political theater and interrupted a live press conference without identifying himself or having his Senate security pin on as he lunged towards Secretary Noem. Mr. Padilla was told repeatedly to back away and did not comply with officers' repeated commands. Secret Service thought he was an attacker and officers acted appropriately. And Secretary Noem gave her version of events later Thursday on Fox News.
He didn't say who he was, that until he was already had been lunging forward and people were trying to detain him. If he had requested a meeting, I would have loved to have sat down and had a conversation with him. That coming into a press conference like this is political theater. It's wrong and it does a disservice to this country and the people who live here.
But Padilla had his own version of events. Take a listen.
I had the audacity to try to ask a question. I introduced myself. It took all of maybe a second for multiple agents to forcibly remove me from the room, to pin me on the ground and handcuff me. What we've seen here cannot be normalized.
Following the incident, reactions began pouring in from all sides. Former Vice President Kamala Harris, writing on X, called it a, quote, shameful and stunning abuse of power. And Padilla's colleague, Senator Chris Murphy, had this to say on the floor of the Senate.
Even if you believe that he was disrespectful, and given the times that is certainly in the eye of the beholder, that never justifies what we saw on that video. If this is how a United States Senator can be treated, none of our constituents are safe.
Stephen A. Smith also lending his voice to the discourse, addressing his criticism directly to Padilla. Take a listen.
So that was just you out of control because you were just losing it up. You, a United States Senator, couldn't compose yourself and let the head of Homeland Security finish her thoughts before you asked the question. Couldn't do that, huh?
And House Speaker Mike Johnson saying this.
A sitting member of Congress should not act like that. It is beneath a member of Congress. It is beneath a U.S. Senator. I do think that it merits immediate attention by their colleagues over there, and that they need. I think that behavior at a minimum is it rises to the level of a censure. I think there needs to be a message sent by the body as a whole that is not what we are going to do.
Well, you want to go first or will I?
Sure, I'd be happy to go first.
Okay.
I thought he behaved completely inappropriately, and the full video, I know oftentimes the video that we see of that starts where he starts shouting, "I'm Senator Padilla," but when you watch from a different angle and several seconds before, he starts shouting over Secretary Noem while she's still delivering remarks from the press conference. It's after he starts shouting that these agents start to push him back and ask him to leave, and then he shouts, "I'm Senator Padilla and I came to ask a question." Like, at that point, you've been asked to leave, you've already interrupted the press conference, you don't get to shout senator as if it's an immunity claim. I think maybe they went too far in wrestling to the ground outside of the press conference, but the removal I thought was totally above board.
So no surprise, I completely disagree with that. I thought that for a start, the point about him identifying himself, he is adamant that people in the room did know who he was because he was elsewhere in the building at the start and asked a member of the National Guard and an FBI agent to let him into Noem's press conference, which they did. Now, the point about him raising his voice, shouting or whatever, you can argue that that is disruptive or whatever. That does not, to my mind, come anywhere close to justifying the images we're seeing there of the way that he was manhandled. I think that that is way, way over the top. Also, in relation to some of the justifications that have been offered for this, and you were talking about different camera angles. A number of people, including the DHS spokesperson, has talked about Padilla lunging at Noem. The other camera angle reveals even more clearly than that one. He did not lunge at Noem. He wasn't within arm's reach of her at any point. He was shouting questions. You can argue about the decorum of shouting questions, but to imagine that the shouting of questions should end up with someone being held down on the ground and handcuffed, I think is absurd with anyone, and particularly so with a US Senator.
What do you think the appropriate response should be if someone starts shouting during a live press conference by a cabinet secretary?
I think you can either answer the question, you can wait it out, or you can ask for that person to be removed. You don't need them to be handcuffed. You don't need them to be wrestled to the floor. And that is, I think, evidence of just a feeling among law enforcement that there is a kind of impunity with which they can act.
But Niall, they did ask him to leave, and that was when he turned around and pushed back into the officers towards Secretary Noem. So at that point, if you're resisting officers' commands to leave the room, they have every right to forcibly remove you if you refuse to do it and start resisting.
Yes, but they were trying to get him out as soon as he put questions to them. When they then pushed him out, he pointed out that he was a US Senator. Then the question is, what is a proportionate response to a member of the US Senate asking questions at a press conference? And that isn't it.
Well, he also wasn't wearing a Senate security pin, so anybody could have been in there saying, I'm Senator so-and-so, or I'm a U.S. official,
The reason
right?
he was let in the first place, Amber, was because he already told them he was a
But that doesn't
senator.
mean the Secret Service people who are there protecting Kristi Noem knew what he told the National Guardsman outside the door.
No, well, it was a National Guardsman and an FBI agent who escorted him to the press conference. That's his version. Not that there was somebody in the lobby and he just talked to them on his way past. So this claim that they didn't know he was a senator, or that nobody knew he was a senator, I think is dubious. I think there is a distinction to be drawn about at what point he identified himself to the people directly there. I will grant you that.
Yeah.
But the response is ridiculously disproportionate.
I mean, to me also the senator thing is kind of irrelevant, because being a senator doesn't give you immunity from consequences if you act out of order. Which is what he did in pushing back on those officers who were trying to remove him, resisting their orders to leave.
Well, but surely the officers acted disproportionately in pushing him for asking a question at a press conference.
But it wasn't Q&A period. He was interrupting her prepared remarks.
He's the elected representative of however many million people are the electorate in California.
So if someone is giving remarks on the House floor and one of the other lawmakers starts shouting at them from their seat, like it's fine because they're an elected official?
I would not support in that circumstance a House lawmaker being handcuffed and thrown to the floor, no.
Well, I agree with you that the handcuffing and thrown to the floor outside of it is probably too far. But look, even former FBI official Josh Campbell, who worked under James Comey, gave an interview on CNN about this. And he said the whole way through that the officers behaved completely appropriately, that they have no requirement, they shouldn't play into someone deliberately interrupting prepared remarks during a press conference, shouting out over a cabinet secretary, and then immediately resisting officers' requests to leave.
Well, I mean, I don't agree with them, and I have a different view. In relation to the shouting and all of that, because I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree on many of the integral parts of this, but the shouting followed a remark from Noem in which she said that federal agents were going to liberate this city from its leadership. It is the leadership of Los Angeles is the leadership because the people of Los Angeles elected them. And the Trump administration has then put federal troops in over the wishes of that leadership. And that argument that you're going to liberate the city because you have decided it against the democratically elected leadership is, again, just pretty egregious in my view.
Okay.
President Trump seems to be eyeing a rollback of his hardline deportation policy. Have the mass protests worked? We'll talk about that.